away, Kaley.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Kaley. Welcome to the Tom, Stu, and You Do a Podcast. I'm Kaley. So here we are. Welcome, gents, to your own pod.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kaley.
Hey.
That was brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks for introducing the podcast, and thank you for coming back on again, because this is the second time that you've been on the podcast. How have you been since last time?
My pleasure. Oh, I've been great. Just been in this little thing called a global pandemic. So we'll just skate right on past that because everyone is experiencing the same pandemic fads that I am. But no, to be serious, I'm doing great. And I'm really excited to be here. Yeah. Thanks, guys. How about you?
Yeah, all good. Just the same, really. I'm sure that everyone's got that pandemic fatigue and looking for a way out, and hopefully we'll have that soon, notwithstanding the new variants that hopefully don't cause too much disruption. But yeah, we have a roadmap here in the UK, and hopefully we can start to ease things and start to see people, see family, and get back to some level of normality, I guess. That's how things are here in the UK.
Amen. Let's return back to normal so we can, fix some stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Like what we're talking about today. I'm really excited you guys asked me to be on for this episode. It's a topic that is really important to me, as I'm sure as it is to you. And I'm really stoked to bust some myths and establish some timelines and understanding. So thanks for having me on here today.
Of course, yeah. I mean, we always like to get you on for the easy topics to talk about,
Yeah, the easy topics.
For everyone that doesn't remember, Kaley joined one of her amazing friends, Sarah, to discuss feminism and how we can get men to care about feminism and why they should even care about it. And along the same veins of that, and in continuation of our last episode on toxic masculinity, we thought, why not have a chat about violence against women and how that's perpetuated, how society, toxic masculinity influences the impacts of that, and again, why should men care? How do we get men to care about what is being perpetuated throughout society, and how do we make a change? How do we actually improve it? Because we don't quite want to go back to normal, as it were, before pre-pandemic. We want to go back to a much, much better normal, and hopefully this is just one very small part of that.
Absolutely. I think that this is an important conversation to have. I know it's something that Stu and I really wanted to discuss in light of what happened in the UK recently, which has been a catalyst for this sort of conversation and a catalyst for a movement over here, really. So at the beginning of March of this month, a girl named Sarah Everard was killed just walking from a friend's house in London. It turns out a man's been charged with her murder and kidnap, and he is a Metropolitan Police officer. And sadly, her remains were found on the 10th of March as well. When I first heard of this, I couldn't believe it, really. It could have been, my sister, my mum, friends, my partner. So it really hit home to me quite harshly. But it could have happened even before that. There's so many women that are victims of violence and killed every week. But it's good that this one is having a moment, having a this is enough kind of moment, and we need to talk about it. And just before we move on, I guess, all our thoughts, solidarity, condolences are with, her friends and family, and of every woman or girl who is facing violence. In many of the manifestations that violence arises, it's not always just physical. It can be mental and economic as well, which can force them into those kind of scenarios. So thank you, Kaley, for coming on to help us discuss this. We think it's super important, and can't thank you enough for coming on. In your, experience and, from what you've researched for doing this episode, what is the scale of the problem that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, thank you. The scale is enormous. And to give some people a little bit of context for what brings me to this subject, I did my master's in interdisciplinary studies at York University here in Toronto. My research focused on mothers who killed their children, and I looked at modern representations of mothers who kill their children in theater using adaptations of Euripides' Medea, and modern criminal legal cases where women have killed their children. And so, that's quite an extreme example of, what I was researching. But my research really focused on the intersections of gender, violence, the law, and culture. So when it comes to topics like this, I have experience in kind of like looking at these things from like a very wide angled lens. And, when it came to Sarah's murder, what was really striking about it is that, this is a kind of violence that happens very frequently to all sorts of women and minorities. But here in this conversation, we're going to talk about women, mainly focus about women. But her murderer and attacker, because he did, from what we understand, rape her, her attacker was a police officer. And so what really, Sarah is a blonde Caucasian. She's a white, blue-eyed woman who's 33 years old, educated, from what we understand, middle to upper class. And she did everything that she was, quote unquote, supposed to do to keep herself safe in public. Globally speaking, London as a jurisdiction is the most surveilled place in the entire world. It is covered by a closed circuit television network that has individuals roaming the streets, completely surveilled from the moment that they leave their home to the moment that they step into another private domain. So the fact that Sarah was missing for almost 10 days, I think 7 days, maybe 10, is extraordinary and quite unusual for, many jurisdictions and large urban centers, but particularly for London. And the other thing that was seemingly unusual is the fact that her murderer, or her alleged murderer, because he is arrested, he's on trial, he hasn't been convicted yet, is a police officer. So what does this mean? Like, why is this surprising? We know in recent history, as recent as last year with the murder of George Floyd in the United States, that, police are under a microscope. Police as an institution are under a larger microscope. When it comes to violence against people of color, particularly men of color in the United States, people with sexual and gender identity differences that do not fall on the binary, so non-binary folks and trans people. But what's really seemingly shocking about Sarah's murder is that, she is the demographic that police are, quote unquote, supposed to be protecting. White, blonde hair, blue-eyed, educated white women of a certain class, and even she wasn't safe. And so what this really brings home is that, as writer Charlotte Shane, she wrote this incredible essay. She writes, and I quote, "The state is the single biggest threat to women's health and safety. It administers violence directly through policing and incarceration, and indirectly through relentless deprivations and oppressions that maintain a regime of interpersonal violence against women, that keep women underpaid and isolated, dependent on male partnership or state surveillance to access resources." So what is this? I mean, I could have put that into my own words, but what I really think is so powerful about what Charlotte wrote is that it's the state. Because what we often do, and I promise I'll wrap up here in a second, that what we often do and what happened in the wake of Sarah's murder is women started sharing online the ways in which they feel unsafe in public. They hold their keys between their fingers when they're walking home. They cross to the other side of the street when a man is walking behind them, in a way to, underscore what is essentially a gender war. It's men against women. But what Charlotte so brilliantly writes in her essay, and maybe you guys can put it in the show notes, I'll send it to you after, is that it's not necessarily a gender war. It's a war between the individual and the state. And it's something that the state really needs to manage, because until men feel and understand that there are state-sanctioned consequences for their violence against women, nothing is going to change. Welcome to my TED. So that is what I, in my research, looking at Sarah Everard's case and what makes this different. Why is the conversation different now in 2021? Previously, it used to be, now let's take this as an opportunity to tell men why they should care about individual women's safety. What's different now is more people are coming to accept and talk about the fact that it really is a state responsibility. And we can talk more about that. What do you guys think about all that?
I personally am really glad that you brought up the issue of the state. I think that's really important. I think that
Tom loves a good
one
state.
of the things that has happened since the Sarah Everard thing, I mean, it was in the works before, but certainly since the Sarah Everard case happened, is that there's been a push for like more authoritarian laws to come into effect, which attack the right to protest, number one. You can, under this new proposed legislation, you can face prosecution, face jail time for causing a, quote, serious annoyance. Now, what a serious annoyance is, and, I don't know what that is. That could be anything, and to whom as well. You can get more time for defacing a statue, 10 years, than you do get for rape. So it's just it's the prioritizing of private property over, violence against women, again, clearly. I think what was really important in other things that you brought up was the intersectionality with race as well. I'd be remiss to not bring up the case of Mina Smallman, whose daughters were murdered last summer, and they're of a black ethnic origin, and police officers who attended their bodies thought that they were safe enough to take selfies with the dead bodies, and it just shows the impunity that they think that they can act with. She said that, quote, "If ever we need an example of how toxic it has become, those police officers felt so safe, so untouchable, that they felt that they could take photographs of dead black girls and send them on." That shows, what a problem is the state and with the state, and especially because it was last summer that that would have been during the time of Black Lives Matter and everything. Again, those girls were murdered by a man as well. Do you think that the state is such a problem? Because if you think about it in terms of history, and Stu and I have spoke about history being so important still to inform, the day. The ramifications of slavery still ripple through to this day. Women in the UK only achieved suffrage 100 years ago. In the United States, they only achieved the right to make decisions about their own bodies in like the 70s and things like that. Do you think that the state is, it's made by men for men, and that's why there's this violence perpetuated against women?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think so. Speaking about history, kind of doing a bit of digging here in Canada. I mean, so much of our culture, our global culture, is informed by what happens in the United States. Certainly here in Canada, we have a bit, we have our own history, but kind of based, looking at domestic violence is what, the trends of what was happening in the United States. And, so like everything in America, terrible that happens. Its roots can be found in Puritanism. So kind of the beginning of the 1600s, mid 1600s, I think 1640, in the Massachusetts colony, domestic violence, spousal abuse was illegal. The Puritans, they relied heavily on community policing to regulate violence in the home. So that is, kind of a starting point. But I kind of I skipped over a couple hundred years, then to the 1800s, where the temperance movement started to gain popularity in the United States, and the temperance movement was really led by women who were trying to curb spousal abuse and domestic violence. They wanted their husbands to stop drinking and bringing this violence to their homes. The temperance movement, it had a bit of a stay in the United States, then it stopped because of World War I, and they needed the alcohol tax revenue in order to fund the war. So the temperance movement dropped off. But then, the 70s, 1976 in particular, is a very big year in the United States for discussions on domestic violence. The very first book published on domestic violence, called Battered Wives by Del Martin, is published in 1976. Ms. Magazine, which was, edited, the head editor-in-chief, was famously Gloria Steinem. One of their first publications that they ever put out that was called Battered Wives. Back then, the magazine, it was larger than the standard size of magazine that we have today. And it was a picture of a woman on the cover. She was a white woman with a black eye, Battered Wives. It sparked like an international conversation, needless to say, national conversation on male violence against women in the home. And so 1976, was a very big year. And in the 70s and leading up to the 80s, this is when individuals started becoming aware of it, but there was no state intervention. And what should have happened is that the public social system should have swooped in, created organizations, created a network for women. But instead, what happened, it was individuals who created like patchwork systems, and academics as well, who started talking about it, created patchwork systems to, create a social safety net for, women who are being abused in the home. And that's still what exists today. And so it's been like a long 50 years, and we're now realizing that like it's not enough. Because as long as men are legislating, as long as men are policing, it's not going to change. So yeah, that's my long answer.
No, that's great.
Yeah,
we love long answers, and it's an important topic. I think in terms of domestic abuse, it's a huge problem here in the UK as well. Just the scale of violence against women when you look into these statistics is harrowing, really. 90% of women aged between 18 and 24 here experience sexual harassment. That's 80% of women overall, notwithstanding those age ranges. 2 women are killed every week in the UK by, a current partner or a former partner. Women don't feel safe often to go to the police. There's, brilliant work by an investigative journalist called Alexandra Heel, who shows that the rates of domestic violence within the police force is higher than the population. And there's often a sort of like, they're one of us, type of mentality with the police kind of thing, and they don't investigate it. That could have been what happened with this Wayne Couzens guy as well in the Sarah Everard case, because he was reported for indecent exposure 3 days before Sarah went missing, and that wasn't, taken up or anything like that. So yeah, just the scale of the problem is so bad, and also the effect that the pandemic might be having on domestic violence when people are forced together. They can't meet with friends or confide in friends. Women's work has been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of job losses and things like that, which again forces them in another kind of violence, an economic violence, into the pockets of their partners and things like that, because they don't have the means to escape. That is happening at the same time that funding for refuges and things like that and women's charities is being cut and slashed and affected. And so, to me, here there seems to be loads. If you take a step back and look at the statistics and look at the big picture of what's going on, and historically, it's really hard to come up with solutions. And I don't think the solution, as is being propounded in the UK at the moment, is more police officers.
No.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I'm really glad that you brought up, how this intersects with the pandemic. It was one of the first things that people started talking about when the stay-at-home orders started. It was like, holy shit, what are we going to do now about people who experience violence in the home, where violence, where the home is not a safe place. And everyone was like, well, we know it's a problem, but we can't do anything about it because we literally have no institutional structure around it. And mental health and all that, also got folded into it. But this idea of domestic violence and violence in the home was like at the top of people's minds. They were like, so complicated. We can't deal with it. But yeah, certainly, like, it is a problem that we've known for a very long time. And this is, when it comes down to interpersonal responsibility, I shrug. For the listener at home, you can't see, but I shrug. That's not really a solution either, because when it comes to toxic masculinity and we say, okay, men need to hold other men accountable, what does that look like, right? That interpersonal accountability often looks like shame. It's public shaming. And it can be, no matter how gentle the shaming is, like, hey man, like, don't say that. You're making her uncomfortable. In a structure of like toxic masculinity, that is enough to, elicit a punch. It's enough to elicit like a reaction that isn't, you know what, man, thanks. You're totally right. I should stop harassing this girl. And so that isn't really an answer either. And so we have to go one above interpersonal solutions. And those are the ones that are state sanctioned. Because again, like what I said, my first answer is like, until men feel and know that there are state sanctioned consequences for the violence that they enact against women, it's just not going to change. Yeah, I don't know how you guys feel about that, though, I
would almost take it a step further. So I was reading this excellent article in the New Statesman, and I'm just going to quote one of the last couple of sentences of one of the paragraphs, and it says, there has to be something more than tough sentencing to keep us safe, although obviously we're not even there yet. So tough sentencing first, and then and interpersonal as well. But I think as a society, and this is where the next point comes in, it says, if the only reason a man does not hit you is that he does not want to be imprisoned, he will just find another way to hate and abuse. And so the hate has to end somehow, and perhaps tough sentencing can only come with a real rather than superficial recognition that women matter. And I think that's the key point there, is that it's not even just interpersonal shaming, which, might work some of the time. And that's only if you put the onus on individual men to call out the small circle of men they have in their circle of influence, for example. And then tough sentencing will also, stop a few more people. But until we have like as close to true gender equality as we can possibly get, where it's not just individual men trying to shame their friends, but all of society standing together to say, hey, this behavior isn't okay. Sentencing alone isn't going to work. We need to go that further step. And that's where it starts to get complicated, in that it's all of these issues are related. And so when someone says, well, we can't possibly just fix domestic violence by this one small little thing, you're like, no, we can't. It's all connected. And there's a reason why we have a discussion on a podcast about toxic masculinity one week. We discussed feminism, a few months earlier, and now we're talking about violence against women. Like, all of these things are connected, and it has to be a holistic approach to end this. You can't just look at things in isolation. And I think that's what people are trying to do. They're trying to look at things in isolation and say, oh, well, it's almost too hard. This isn't going to work for X, Y, Z reason. If the government comes out and says, oh, we're just going to create a new minister position that says, her job description is to reduce the impact of domestic violence, like that also isn't good enough. That's almost virtual signaling on the behalf of the government, because that one job title isn't enough to end discrimination against women, no matter what she puts in a job description.
Yeah. Also on that point, sometimes the sentencing that they put forward in legislation is just virtue signalling, because hardly any of it ends up in convictions. I think the convictions for rape in the UK is at less than 3% of reported cases. In 2019-2020, the UK police recorded 53,130 rapes, and of those, 1,439 were convicted. It creates a culture where it's almost like you're going to get away with it. So it's just, so I think you're totally right to say that, there needs to be, the sentence in there that is a deterrent to this kind of behaviour, but it is a case of having a holistic approach and, bringing in education and bringing in personal responsibility and accountability and, being an ally with women. And, I agree with the whole silence is complicity type thing. When the after the vigil and the hashtag reclaim the streets and things like that, which had echoes of reclaim the night and things like that from the 70s, I think it was. There was a hashtag called like not all men, and I was like, what is that? It sounded a lot like all lives matter, is what it sounded
exactly
like. It was just so dumb. Yeah. But there's that kind of mentality that needs to be, and that does come from toxic masculinity. So that's why I'd encourage people to listen to the last episode. But I think men, because of the culture and because of the fact that society is created by men for men, and it's hierarchical and its structure, super competitive in terms of that's what capitalism is all about. That it creates this situation whereby men can't feel vulnerable and speak to people and speak to whoever, friends, whatever. So then the only way that they can express themselves is through violence in the end. And that needs to be broken down. And how do we break that down? Through education, obviously through, deterrence and sentences and things like that. But that's what we really need to figure out, is how to end toxic masculinity, basically.
Yeah, I'm so glad you both brought all of that up. I mean, I think one thing that does get lost in this conversation is like, what type of people hurt other people? And it is most often, people who are hurt. And so one of like there's been a lot of research on, domestic violence, not take it back now, not domestic violence, on men who beat their wives in the home. There's been a lot of research done since the 1970s and a little bit before the 1970s on what constitutes this type of person. And, it comes back to intergenerational trauma and intergenerational violence. Men who watch their husbands, watch their fathers, beat their moms, will go on, like almost 100%, to beat their own wives. In the same way, men, and it is the same for girls as well, but it manifests a little bit differently. So I am going to talk about boys, but, people who are molested as children will often, as adults, molest other children. It's a cycle that needs to be broken. And so I'm not saying that every man who rapes is like, has experienced, something terribly traumatic in their past. But oftentimes they have. And so, those cycles also need to become interrupted and dealt with. Certainly it is true. There are people who do experience violence in their home as children who don't go on to perpetrate that as adults. But there's enough research to indicate that it does happen statistically enough that there does need to be these types of interventions. And what happens is, because we still in Western culture see the home as a private sphere and not a place where the state, in terms of police or social services, can intervene. Although social services do intervene in the home in very many problematic ways that we can talk about later or in another episode. It's not a perfect system. I have a big beef against social workers. Don't quote me on that. That's going to come and bite me in the ass in the future. But whatever, I don't care. I have a beef. historically, we do know, when women call the police when they're experiencing domestic violence in their home, there is very little that police, as a force, as an institution, can do to protect women in the home, which is why women often have to murder their husbands in order, to stop the beatings. And then they end up going to jail for murdering their husbands, where there is, a huge police record of women calling the police to come to their house for like 20 years, and the police can't do anything. And then these women go to jail. Oh, what's this book called? It's called Women Who Kill. I lent it to my friend Gabby like 3 years ago, and I haven't got it back. But it's a fantastic book. I'm literally going to Women Who Kill. It's a fantastic book. It's by Anna Jones. It's incredible. So yeah, it's like this is what happens, and women often have to murder their husbands before they get any state intervention. And so this is a problem, right? Like, we have to teach, men who experience violence in their home at a young age to like not do that. But, what is a teacher supposed to do when they see their student's mother, who clearly has a black eye that's being covered by terrible makeup? This teacher knows that violence is happening in the home. There's nothing she can do about it. That is an intervention that can happen at the state level from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Correctional Services. Like, they can figure it out. You know what I mean? Child Protective Services. But we don't do that, right? Structurally, the institution is set up, but there is no will. There is no will. And that's my beef.
Yeah, no, definitely. Do you think that the lack of the will comes from the politics? Because, when I think about, violence against women, toxic masculinity, I'm always taken back to that picture of Trump signing that, legislation about what women can do with, their reproductive organs and things like that for foreign aid, I think it was, or something like that. Not one woman in the room with regard to that legislation. So do you think it's a political problem? Do you think it comes from the politics? Because I also think that, personally, in my view, people such as Priti Patel, we have in the UK as the Home Secretary, very authoritarian woman, very harsh, very competitive, embraces a lot of these, traditionally male characteristics, I'd say, in terms of, operating within a capitalist system. But she's got to the top, and I fear about women internalizing that and having to become that in order to succeed within the system. Zora Sultana, who's a Labour MP for Coventry, made a brilliant point that the failures of Cressida Dick, who is the Met Police Chief, and Priti Patel, who's the Home Secretary, show that even when women get to the top in these systems, women aren't protected. So there seems to be a problem with representation politics there as well. That the fact that even if there's a woman, in power, you're not going to be helped in a capitalist system. So, I guess my question is: do you think that fundamentally you have to change the system in which we live in to deal with this problem as well?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we do. Here's the thing: like, women, like, internalized misogyny is real in the same way that like internalized homophobia, internalized racism, internalized anti-Semitism. I'm a Jewish person. I, have dealt with that in my past. So, it is a way in which the, white, cis, hetero, male patriarchy teaches you to hate yourself if you do not fit into that, structure. And in order to succeed in the structure, you must become it. And that is why women, like the ones that you just mentioned, exist. Now, can we hold them accountable? Like, yes and no. Like, yes, in the sense that, like, fuck, don't be a traitor to your gender. And then, no, because they're victims as well. So that's where it gets complicated.
Okay, back after a technical glitch. Kaley,
I
was asking you about the system in general.
The system.
The
Yes.
system.
The system. Yeah. I mean, okay, here we go. Well, if we're going to talk about the system and women who, you know, gain power in the system, you know, what we feminists say is like, the patriarchy won't protect you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you are able to ascend within the system of the patriarchy, politics, religion, you're able to marry a man who provides protection for you, both financially and just within the home structure. At the end of the day, you are not you are a beneficiary of the patriarchy, and it is because of the patriarchy that you are safe. But just in a second, that can turn on you. And so, you know, there is such thing as internalized misogyny, internalized homophobia, internalized racism, internalized anti-Semitism, internalized fatphobia, Islamophobia, all of these things. If you are not a white, cis, Christian, heterosexual male within the system of the patriarchy, like, you are at risk of hating yourself. And finding that internal power is outside of the structure of the patriarchy is very difficult, but it can happen. And that is what feminism is here to do. That is the work of one of the works of feminism. And so when it comes to the institutionalized structures of this white male Christian hetero patriarchy, like religion and politics, you know, women can ascend in that ladder, but at a certain point, again, like I just said before, at a certain point, they will reach a threshold where they realize that it doesn't matter how much power they have, they are powerless to make meaningful change, or they become active representatives of the patriarchy by, you know, blocking abortion rights, or by claiming that, well, as long as we have men around to protect women, it's fine. As long as we have guns, it's fine. So yeah, like, we do need whole scale system change. I personally am an incrementalist. I don't believe in large scale. I don't believe that large scale power changes, institutional power changes, I don't believe that they often create the change that we set out to make. We set out to make a change, a revolution happens, and then there is a power vacuum and it gets filled by something equally, if not more, problematic. And so I believe in incremental change, small changes, which is difficult and frustrating, and it requires allyship. But yeah, that is my answer to that question.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, of course you did. I think you did. And just to, you know, add some other things to what you're saying about the state, I think it's telling how, you know, you just need to look at the US and the UK, how they seem to resort to violence often, you know, in terms of foreign policy, whether that be wars or, you know, skirmishes abroad, or the militarization of the police and things like that. It seems to me that violence is always one of the main things that the state, or, you know, the leaders of our nations, you know, have recourse to in order to solve problems, or, you know, solve problems that they perceive. And so when you have that kind of situation where even the state uses violence, and then you look at culture as well, and we spoke about some things in the last episode on toxic masculinity, such as, you know, just things like James Bond and his attitudes toward women and violence and things like that, and what kind of effect does that have on people. When you have those two things sort of operating in symbiosis kind of thing, what kind of results do you expect? It's probably going to be some sort of violent outlash. What kind of impact do you think culture has then on this issue of violence against women?
Yeah. Culture. Good question. I mean, look, like there's been a lot of like poetry wax about like the problem of the depiction of violence in media. And honestly, I think Cher Horowitz and Clueless, like this is not a joke. I'm being very serious. I think Cher Horowitz from Clueless says like, until mankind stops being violent, why should we take it away? Why should we take away the enjoyment from violence in media? I mean, look, I think it is a problem. You know, is there probably a correlation between like the depiction of violence in media and how it teaches young children to behave? Absolutely. There is probably something there. Do I think we can scrub all violence away from human life? Probably not. So I think having like a mediating factor in there would help. But I think, you know, media culture. So if we're going to talk about culture and, you know, media as a part of the culture, and we're talking about theater, social media, we're talking about, well, theater and social media and film and television. Let's go there. You know, it is a very important tool to help people understand as an audience how to understand what's going on in the world. And so, yes, like gratuitous violence is not ideal. I don't think it's great. But I don't know. I'm actually quite conflicted about this question. I'm curious what you guys think about it, because I do, you know, take Game of Thrones, for example. Gratuitously violent, gratuitously overtly sexy with regards to the naked female body. And it did respond to audience outcry about the disproportionate amount of the naked female body that, you know, the audience was subject to. But at the same time, watching that show as a, you know, someone in my late 20s when that was happening in Canada, who, yes, I have been, by virtue of my privilege, subject to very little violence in my life, physical violence. I haven't watched a lot of physical violence. I haven't been privy to it. Watching that show, I was like, war is bad. And people die, and it's not great. And I know that makes me sound like unsophisticated, but that's how deeply privileged I am in terms of like being safe as a upper middle class educated Jewish woman living in a large urban center for my entire life. And that being said, I lived in Israel for a year and a half. I was like in close proximity to a lot of global violence, but I didn't actually witness any of it. Yeah. So it's things like that, and also watching like historical film, like historical dramas, like 1917. There we go. Where I was like, wow, World War I, literally fought by teenage children, teenage boys. So bad. And I know that, again, like as an educated person who has learned a lot about the world, who is worldly, it even took me by surprise. And that is the power of media, right? And so do I think that we need to scrub away every instance of interpersonal violence and global violence from media? Like, no. But do I think that, you know, one of the pieces of media where this conversation takes up a lot of hot air is video games. And like, I think that video games are great. They help people's concentration. It's mindfulness. It's meditative to a certain extent. There's an interpersonal, there's a social aspect to it. It really helps with problem solving. Do I think that every game needs to involve, like, be, like, have guns and, like, no. So that's kind of how I approach it. I'm sure other experts would have, like, much more articulate things to say about it, but that's how I feel. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, though.
No, it's great. It's great. I agree. I think it's a balance. I think that you know, I'm not for scrubbing all those things away as well. It's I believe in like freedom of expression and things like that. But I do think it is important to keep an eye on how these things do affect the culture, or how men see themselves in the world, like with the James Bond thing, for example. That does accentuate and glorify, typical toxic masculine traits of, violence. His attitude towards women is terrible. But it's about knowing and being educated that those things, that's fiction, right? And that it doesn't have a bearing on the real world, or shouldn't have a bearing on the real world. One of the things that I've noticed, in the aftermath of the Sarah Everard case, is that I'm glad that a lot of the conversation is on men. A lot of it is pointed at men, instead of, because typically, when we had the Me Too movement and things like that, often people would say, well, what was she doing there, or what was she wearing, etc. But now it's more about, no, men, just, take account of yourselves. And I think that that's the direction that we do need to go in, because before it's just been scapegoating and blaming women for being in that situation, walking that route at night, etc. And this is the kind of thing we need to change to move forward, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah did everything right. She did everything that she was supposed to do. It was 9:00 at night, which isn't late, but it is considered nighttime, I guess. She was fully covered up. She was on the phone with her boyfriend. I have, certainly walked in downtown Toronto late at night, and I think this might not be the best idea. And then I quickly shoved that thought out of my mind, because Ubers are expensive and I'm only going 20 minutes or whatever. And Uber isn't even necessarily safe, like a safe option. And, I'll call my dad, or I'll call, someone else. And, and yeah, because that's what everybody tells you to do. Like, being on the phone with somebody else is supposed to protect you from being snatched. It's not. Oi, just sneezed there. Sorry. And yeah, she did everything right, and she still got raped and brutally murdered. So, I mean, that is an important. Yeah, it is important that conversation shift. Yeah.
I think this is where,
because
I think this is where toxic masculinity in particular, and this is why I wanted to have this discussion straight after the episode we had on that topic, where that really comes into play, because it seems to be that a lot of the pushback against this whole domestic violence is always a man's fault, is that they can come up with a number of reasons and a number of examples where it wasn't a man. Women can hit their husbands too, and it's not always a white man hitting a woman who's at home, all that sort of stuff. But I think, so the National Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, just released that 10-year report that I shared with both of you when it came out a week ago. And it says that women are much more, was 35% more likely to experience domestic violence at home when they start to earn more than 50% of the household's income. And, a lot of people would say, like, oh, how will it's a decade-long study. So they've done a long-term study with tens of thousands of people. They've looked into all the different possible reasons why this might happen. And it's only when the gender norm is violated that increase in incidences of physical violence and emotional abuse at home happens. It's not it's when the man feels hurt. And I think, Kaley, you said this earlier off air, but it's the people that hurt other people are those that feel hurt themselves. And it's when a man feels attacked, their masculinity is being attacked because of this whole cultural shifting. That makes a person more likely to react with violence. And this leads, I guess, into the discussion that I don't want to spend too long on, but the conversation around incels, which we mentioned briefly in Toxic Masculinity episode as well, where it's involuntary celibate men and the existence of female celibates who call themselves femcels, because obviously it's, again, not all men, of course not. There's always going to be examples of people, on both sides of the argument. But what I found interesting when I was reading into incels versus femcels is that incels are more likely to hurt other people when they feel attacked. And that's why, a lot of the mass shooters in the last decade have been white guys who have felt like society hasn't treated them as fairly as they have expected to do. Whereas females are more likely to internalize that hurt and feel like it's their own fault. And, they agree that sometimes domestic violence is acceptable. This is real women in these situations being beaten by the husband saying like, oh, it's sometimes it's okay. Like I should have been doing better. And it goes back to that internalized misogyny that you were talking about earlier too.
Yeah, I mean, typically that is how men and women on the binary are socialized, that like women hurt themselves and men hurt others. And it's so typical that it's tragic, right? Like the way that it manifests. And, this is one of the things about, when talking about violence, gender and violence, it's so not deep. You know what I mean? Like the institutional problem is deep. How deep it goes, how hard it is to root out is deep, but the symptoms and the reason and how it functions is so at the surface of society that it just like permeates our every system. And that's why like anyone can talk about it, anyone can do something about it, anyone can, in their day-to-day life. But that's why it's so depressing to talk about, right? Because we all know it. It's all in the air. We all have experience with it from, the time we are very, very little to probably on this very day, you have experienced some form of gendered violence, whether it's physical violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, financial violence. These are all a part of the political gender violence. Like these are all manifestations of violence. It's not just a punch in the face. So this is why this problem is so hard to talk about, because it's personal to everyone, and yet it's public. It's everywhere. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I hadn't actually heard of femcells, probably because I too don't really like reading about incels. Even though I know enough about them, I feel like I know enough about them that I don't need to do any more reading. Yeah. But that's not the truth. Clearly, there's more research and more, there's been reporting on female incels. So,
but again,
I guess there's some reading to do.
But again, even on that, so even when I was reading about that, again, the way it's reported, it's almost like you're surprised that femcells exist because it's stigmatized that women can always get sex if they need it. And a lot of the reason why femcells exist and it gets perpetuated within themselves, and they feel like it's all internalized as well, is because all of these people are saying like, you're not involuntarily celibate. Like that's the choice you have, because obviously any woman could possibly go out there and get it if they wanted to. And it's all of this, again, it's all of this negative reporting generally by guys saying that like, oh, your problems aren't real problems because how dare they? Our problems are definitely worse than yours because we don't get that choice. Again, like it's just this big rabbit hole that you just can't, I mean, I can't stop going down, where it's like, it's like people argue against something for the same reason that they're feeling hurt themselves. And it's whole concept, like, I hate to bring it up again, but toxic masculinity, where it's always the guy, a man is feeling hurt because he feels like his masculinity, his entire self-identity is being hurt, but then he's hurting other people based on their self-identity. So it's just perpetuating the cycle of hate. And then again, it's emotional abuse, right? It's emotional violence. And And so, as you say, it's deeply personal for everyone, and which is why we don't generally talk about it. Which is why, even just announcing that we were going to do this episode, so many people were like, "Oh, that's so brave of you! Like, good on you for having the discussion. Like, why aren't we talking about this more?" Like, and I guess as we start to round out this episode, I guess I want to talk about like how do we get men to care, because as Tom said earlier, we need to be redirecting the conversation, and I think we are starting to see that a little bit, making men, as we said right at the very start, shaming other men in their circles of influence, and trying to tell them like, hey, like this isn't okay, calling out other men, but also taking a second to think internally, how is it the way that I've been raised? How is it the way that I'm feeling in this moment? Why do I feel like I need to lash out to someone telling me that the way I've been acting isn't appropriate? Why is that my initial response? And how do you break that cycle where it's a knee-jerk reaction every time, instead of taking that second to internalize and think about why it is I'm feeling this in the moment, and then what's a more appropriate response?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I wish I had.
You don't have the answer
I wish
for
I
us?
had, like.
What is the point of having you as a guest? Kaley, you've done a master's degree on this.
Let's just cut it out. I mean, I know, honestly, right? I mean, so there are a lot of conversations being had about, how to tackle this problem, right? And one of them is, changing the language. Okay, interpersonally, between men, we know that this kind of like shaming doesn't really work. So we're going to have to find out something else. But in the meantime, practice it at your discretion, trying to have those conversations, within your social circle of cisgendered hetero men. And also in queer circles as well, this, toxic masculinity is a huge problem as well. So having those conversations is really important, and not leaving it up to the women in your social circle to do that emotional labor. So that is like one approach to take. And like, it's going to be a slow move, but we're going to do it. Another thing from like just like an interpersonal level is to, kind of change the way we talk about, right now we use a more passive term, violence against women, but what we really should be talking about is male violence against women, or men who are violent against women. It puts more of a focus on the perpetrator and not on the victim. And so, changing the way that we talk about it. And yeah, I mean, when it comes to, it's hard, right? Like, I don't, like, right now, like, since the 70s, I mean, we, when that's like the modern reigniting of the conversation when it comes to, the safety of women, both in public and in private, to now, 2021, 50 years is like a very short time. What we do have is like a lot of data about what isn't working, right? Like what we know right now is what we're doing is not meaningfully helping. And so what I think this provides in the year of our Gregorian calendar 2021, this gives us a critical opportunity to look around and evaluate. And I think right now what a lot of researchers, and I want to leave legislators out of this, because again, like what we're talking about is this institutional limit that we have on what we're able to do. It's giving people the opportunity to like really evaluate critically in this moment what direction we can take. And we don't really have that answer, right? Which is why it's so frustrating. But I do think, like it like deeply, like it like it's actually so upsetting, because like I'm a person who like loves having an answer for everything, and like I don't. But I think what the answer is that like we just need to keep holding legislators like to account. I believe that like while I'm like an incrementalist in terms of change, and usually that incrementalism for me is represented like at the polls. But like waiting 4 years in between elections is like just too long. And when the pandemic, lifts a little bit more and we're able to take to the streets more, protest is like deeply impactful. And while it doesn't always immediately result in legislative change, it really does a lot to ignite conversation. Sometimes that increases polarization, but whatever, then you know who's on your side and you know what you're up against. So it's complicated, right? Like in recent years, we have really seen a lot of public protest in the form of the Me Too movement, which hasn't, that's complicated, but also in terms of like the environment, a lot of public protests with the environment. And that's really helped. And also with Black Lives Matter, as early as last year. So while we haven't fully seen the impact of all of these public protests, it's still happening. We have seen a lot of short-term changes in terms of like culture and conversation. So I think in the short term, let's protest away. Look, Kate Middleton came to the Sarah Everard protest. And, as she lives in Canada, so a part of the British colonies, like, to me, I understand what it takes to get Kate Middleton out of that fucking palace. You know what I mean? Like, she doesn't leave for much, like she's got a job to do. And that is like
that's a
raising those children. Yeah. Well, look, like she's got a job to do. It's raising those children so that they're not so deeply fucked up that they can't continue the monarchy. And she's working with her husband, the future King of England, to, listen, this isn't a conversation about the monarchy. And I'm sure, both of you have a lot to, whatever. But as it exists, Kate Middleton, it takes a lot to get her to leave the house because she's got a real job to do. And leaving for this protest to go be in solidarity with these women, like, that is unprecedented. Her calendar is like planned like years in advance. And so for her to leave the house, to leave the palace for that, like, that is quite a symbol, and something that I don't take lightly. So that's my answer for now. Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. I agree that protest is, that's why I'm so against this police crime bill, whatever they're trying to pass in the UK, because it's trying to basically, it's a move towards authoritarianism, basically. I think it came out as a response to Extinction Rebellion and people like that causing disruption, but under the current situation with coronavirus and then also with the violence against Sarah Everard, it's almost being used as like a political tool to push it through. So we need to resist that move towards authoritarianism. The women's movement is based on getting out and protesting and being visible and winning those rights back through civil disobedience. History tells us that. And it also for all the other rights that we enjoy, as we've said before on the podcast. I think
we love attention. We love.
I think that it's really important to try and stress to men that violence against women affects them too. When I heard about Sarah's case, I immediately thought about my mum and sister, and friends and partner too, and I started talking to them more about these kinds of serious issues, and discovered things and stories and close calls that they themselves had that I didn't even know about. So it's about having that conversation and seeing how close to home it is, because often women just keep this things to themselves. We've seen that with the Me Too movement. It took like 80 women coming forward for them to believe the allegations against Bill Cosby, and many women have stayed silent because of the culture that's been created, and we need to try and break that down. Dealing with toxic masculinity is a huge issue. I feel like men need to be able to be vulnerable and know that it's okay to be vulnerable. Because if you don't have these kind of vents or, you know, ways to let out how you're feeling and things like that, you bottle it up and then it comes out in a violent way. I think that also we have to try and kind of put forward a social responsibility and accountability around men. You know that behavior is a choice and violence is a choice. You know, people who say that they didn't mean to do it, you know, in terms of domestic violence and things like that, think about the other scenarios in which you wouldn't use violence. So, you know, if someone's hit the partner, when was the last time you hit your boss? Oh, I can't do that because I would lose my job. Well, so it is a choice then. You know, you don't have to use violence. I also think we need to see history and the big picture. You know, we spoke about this in terms of slavery and how it affects black people still to this day. You know, unable to get capital and things like that because everything is owned, etc. But, you know, women have traditionally been subordinated, you know, be that in religion, you know, in different, in society, they've been disenfranchised, confined to the home. The work that they've done in the home has been undervalued completely, unpaid. They do the majority of unpaid labor in the world still to this day. And that needs to change as well. And also, just a reference back to the episode 4, Bullshit Jobs, women do most of the care work, and you know, they do most of the work that is caring and that is the least well paid. So, for example, nurses in the UK, I believe it's around 90% of nurses in the UK are female, and there's been a report in the Guardian today saying that 75% of the UK single nurses can't buy a home. That's a different kind of violence to which we need to become attuned as well. It's an economic violence. Violence doesn't always manifest itself in terms of physical, actual bodily harm. It can be economic in nature, and the system that we have definitely contributes towards that. And I think, just finally, I'd like to say that I think that one way that we could maybe move forward, and it's something that I briefly spoke about when I spoke to you and Sarah last time, was that if we can somehow link all violence together, you know, so violence against women, violence against the environment, violence against race, etc., and build a mass movement, I think that would be really powerful. And, you know, so this is just to start a conversation. I don't know how to do that on a personal level. It's all about reaching out and talking to people such as yourself, and talking to other people and trying to come up with that, you know, pathway out of our current predicament.
Amen. I agree. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of power in conversation, a lot of power in storytelling. I mean, I do like what you said about, you know, asking the women in your life about their experiences. You know, women don't talk and men don't ask. I mean, it's kind of this, it's our silent agreement, the silent agreement of the genders. And it is a function of the patriarchy to keep women silent and to keep men in the dark. And that's something that we need to rupture. That's something that we need to break. And I think that is a good start. You know, there are a lot of times where I have wanted to tell, you know, the men in my life about the violence that I've experienced. And they can't hear it, or like they don't want to listen, they can't hear it, or they ask, but they're not prepared for the answer. And it's upsetting. Like, it is, most of the time, I don't want to talk about it, even they ask, because they don't have the resilience to hear. And I don't know what it is. Maybe what they see on TV, they think it's an exaggeration, when oftentimes it's the opposite. It's actually, if not a deeply accurate representation of the kind of violence that women experience on the daily, that it's like boring to watch a lot of the time. But that's a whole other conversation. But, you know, what I would say to the men who are listening, you know, if it's upsetting to you to hear the stories that your female friends are telling you, then imagine what it was like having to go through that. And so it's work, you know, it is work. And it's made me more selective about who I share these stories with. Um, and yeah, but it is really important. And that is one of the ways in which, you know, we can begin to like rupture this, you know, like I said, this like silent agreement. And it's a way that we can kind of like break down toxic masculinity a bit. So yeah, I think that's a great approach. And one thing that, you know, we can do in our own lives.
Yeah, that,
Yeah.
that puts me into mind of a video I watched just the other day, actually, where men were asked to read comments and tweets that were sent to female news reporters, female
Mm,
sports news reporters in particular, and
mm,
to see men physically not able to say words out loud to these ladies that
mm,
were written by complete strangers to them, but having sat down face to face, you know, like only a meter away from these ladies, and apologizing and looking at the camera saying, "Do I actually have to say this out loud?" Um, like that is, and that is how you that is how you get men to empathize with women as opposed to sympathize. And I think I said
mm,
this last episode as well, is when you sympathize with someone, it's very easy to forget about that the next day. You tell me a
mm,
personal story, I can say, "Oh my god, I'm so sorry you went through that," and literally not even think it's a thing tomorrow. Completely forget that you even told me
mhm,
that story. If I
mhm,
empathize with you in the moment, and this is where I think a lot of men struggle, is that yes, they don't have the resilience to hear about it. They don't have the context to understand this is happening to you all the time. This isn't a one-off story that you're telling me for the sake of it. Um,
mhm,
and the reason they don't have the resilience is because they're not thinking about this happening all the time. But if when you can get someone to empathize with you by making them recognize that this is something that your friends and family are going through all the time, this is something that like men in your life and people you see on the streets are doing to other people. That's how you make it stick in their mind. That's how you make it. That's how you make change happen. Because when people are thinking about it all the time and recognizing this is a real issue, um, and getting people talking is the first step at any point, in any sort of change. That's how you actually create the fundamental changes that we need throughout society to recognize that women are equal. Because if we can't create that mental step where we actually recognize women as being equal, we're forever going to be saying like, well, why didn't she what was she wearing? Why, like victim blaming, right? Like, what was she doing? Why
mhm,
was she walking at 10 p.m. at night time to go home? Um, why didn't she call her boyfriend and be on the phone? That sort of stuff. Like, the fact that that happens, and we're thinking more about the woman and her behaviors as opposed to the men instigating it. Um, Positively, I think we are moving in the right direction very slowly. I mean, the recent news that I'm pretty sure it was Georgia or Florida or one of those very conservative states in the US just passed the law to say that it can't be considered it can't be considered rape if the woman intentionally made herself drunk beforehand. Um, that's not exactly positive news, but the reaction to that has been so intense on social media and on news reports throughout the state that hopefully it shows that legislation needs to happen in the right way. And as you say, like we need to actually legislate some of these changes to force men to recognize that it's not okay to behave like this. And I know a lot of economists, for example, are very anxious to allow government even more ability to regulate the way we feel about things and to try to get involved in cultural change. And I bring up economists because, as I mentioned, that Australian Bureau of Statistics report that a lot of the feminist movement right now is trying to encourage or improve the economic welfare of women and try to say, like, if women start earning as much as men, it's going to be better for everyone. But as we heard, when women earn as much or more than men, men feel attacked and therefore domestic violence is more likely to go up. We can't just look at the economics, but it's things like better child raising policies, family payments, parental leave, childbirth, maternity leave and paternity leave. When we start implementing them in a legislative sense, then in our minds we start to see, on a cultural sense, women as being more equal to men in so many different areas of society. That's the way you slowly make change. It's at a personal level, get people to empathize, get the state involved, and then holistically, hopefully, society changes and we have the equality that we are also desperately fighting for.
Amen. Because,
one day,
I don't know. I don't necessarily want to be equal with men. I want men to come down a notch, and I'm kidding.
I was going to say, there are some white men that are pissed off right now.
No, because that's the thing. The playing field. I don't know sports. I have no business using
another
sports
masculinity
analogies.
thing,
Yeah, another. But it's I forget the author of this quote, but it's not enough for us to be equal with men, for women to be equal with men, because then we'll become just as monstrous. It's so that we all come to a better world. And that, and I just butchered the quote again, violence, butchered. LOL. And I'll find the quote. I'll send it to you. But yeah, it's about creating a whole new reality, and that is the reality that you're talking about. Because again, statistically, we see that men don't take paternity leave, even if they want to, because it's not financially viable for them to do so. Because we know the impact that parental leave has on a working person's career trajectory and short-term income. So there's so much structurally that needs to change. But we're on the right path, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's all about communicating and keeping talking, because I think we need to do that to ensure that what's happening now and the progress that's being made, or the direction that we're taking now, isn't lost in the news cycle, which seems to happen all too often. So I agree with you, getting out in the streets, keep talking about it, keep talking to your friends, calling out your friends when their behavior is off. It's all good stuff that we should continue to do. And thank you so much, Kaley, for coming on today and helping us discuss such a sensitive but important topic.
My pleasure. We can talk about something light like murder next time, or I don't know. We'll just see, Yeah. We talked about murder a bit. No, it's my sincere pleasure. I love talking with you guys. I hope your audience agrees. And if there's anything that they would like to talk to me about politely, they can find me on Instagram at Kaley Ames. I check my messages folder. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys, having this conversation. I don't think you're brave. I think you're doing the bare minimum.
Exactly. Yeah. We agree.
We agree. Yeah, definitely. For sure.
That's what I mean by taking men down a notch. No, I'm kidding. I genuinely appreciate it. I think you're doing great work, and I can't wait to see what else you do in the future.
Thank you so much, Kaley. And everyone listening, you can find us at Tom, Stu, and You on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please do let us know your thoughts on this topic. Please do get in touch if you have any questions, queries, comments, suggestions for future episode ideas, or if you just want to tell us you fell asleep listening to our beautiful voices once more, because that seems to be a very common review we get, which is, I think, it's a positive thing. Again, bare minimum. We'll take anything right now.
For sure.
Not with me talking. Maybe with your very gentle, dulcet tone, Australian, British dulcet tones. But me, I am what they call a shrill woman. So I don't think anybody's falling asleep to this episode.
we love having this shrill woman on to tell us how to be better men. It's an absolute pleasure, Kaley. Hopefully we'll get you on another future podcast episode as well. But for everyone else, we'll have another amazing episode and another amazing guest for you probably on the next episode of the Tom Stu and You podcast. But until then, have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye.